Hi, this PowerPoint is designed to help you walk through some of the basics of accentual syllabic metre, which is the predominant type of English metre used in English poetry since the late medieval period. There are other types of metre. Classical poetry was written in quantitative metre, in which the pattern was established by the length of the syllables. Syllabic metre depends on the number of syllables in the line, without attention to where the stress falls on those syllables. And accentual metre depends on the number of stresses in a line, without worrying about the amount of syllables in total. Accentual syllabic metre thus combines features of both syllabic and accentual metre, paying attention to both the number of syllables in a line and the pattern of stresses that occur within it. Let's begin with the terms that you'll need to describe accentual syllabic metre. Feet are the metrical units into which a line is divided. There are 4 feet, which are 2 syllables long: the iamb, the trochee, the sponde and the pyrrhic, and they are called different things depending on where the stress falls within those feet. Then there are 2 feet, which are 3 syllables long: the anapest and the dactyl. Iambs and anapests are known as rising metre because the stress comes at the end of the foot. Trochees and dactyls are the opposite, they're called falling metre. We then have a series of terms which describe the length of the line: monometre, dimetre, trimetre, and so on. In rhyming poetry, the length of the line has a strong effect on the apparent pace of the poem. The shorter the line of the poetry, the more rapidly we'll reach a rhyme word, particularly if the poem is written in couplets, and that makes the poem seem faster. To describe the metre, you need to take a term from the first list, the type of foot, and join it with a word from the second list, which tell you how many feet there are in that line. So a poem composed in iambic pentameter will have 5 2-syllable feet in it, i.e. 10 syllables per line. And the dominant pattern will be unstressed stressed, making a rhythm of da-dum, 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 da-dum. A poem composed in anapestic trimeter, in contrast, would have 3 3-syllable feet, i.e. 9 syllables in all, with the stress falling on the 1st, the 4th and the 7th syllables. Another way of describing the length of the line is simply to count the number of syllables, and this is most often done with lines of 8 or 10 syllables. So an octosyllabic line describes lines of 8 syllables, decasyllabic lines of 10 syllables. There are some English poems which employ the triple metres of anapests and dactyls. The Victorian poet Alfred Lord Tennyson was quite fond of anapestic metre, as we can see in the following line from Break, 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 and the sound of a voice that is still. And there you can sort of hear the emphasis, the stress falling on the 3rd syllable in each foot. We can also look to Tennyson for an example of dactylic metre in The Charge of the Light Brigade: all in the valley of death. And here you can see that with falling metre, dactyls and trochees, you've got the problem of how to end the line. Quite often that last unstressed syllable or syllables are missed off, and this kind of line is called catalectic. And we're going to return to that at the end of the PowerPoint when we have a quick look at trochaic metre. Okay, so that's a brief look at the triple metres, the anapest and dactyl. However, in practice, for most poetry, certainly that composed between 1500 and 1800, you can get away with focusing on just 3 types of feet, namely the iamb, the trochee and the sponde, the feet of 2 syllables. Let's see about applying this terminology to some actual lines of verse. It's important to remember that whilst there are wrong ways to scan a line, there's often a variety of ways in which lines could be scanned, so there's not necessarily one right answer. Further to that, it's also important to remember that very few poems are written in an extremely regular metre. They would sound incredibly boring if they were. So it's not often that you'll find poems of iambic pentameter which are made up of lines which follow the iambic pentameter rhythm exactly in every single line. So if you say that a poem is in iambic pentameter, you're only describing the dominant metre. And when analysing the metre, it's the bits that deviate from the dominant metre that are often the most interesting. So let's see how this works out in practice. Which words is it that need a stress? Broadly speaking, content-bearing words need stressing. Content-bearing words are nouns, verbs, adjectives and adverbs. Take the following line. All the words in this line are monosyllabic, they're only one syllable long. So to decide where the stress falls is simply a matter of deciding which of these are the content-bearing words. And here we've got a verb eat, 3 nouns, world, dew, grave, and a pronoun. Sometimes pronouns won't necessarily get a stress. This one comes at the end of the line, so it's safest to assume that in this case it will. So in this line we end up with 5 stresses. To eat the world's dew by the grave and thee. And if we divide the line into feet, it'll look like this, which makes I am, trochee, I am, and I am. The interesting metrical moment that comes in the second and third feet, where the I am and trochee rub up against each other to produce 2 consecutive stresses, slowing down the pace of the line and emphasising the phrase world's dew. The pace of the line is further slowed down by the fact that these 2 consecutive stresses fall immediately before the caesura, the midline pause that comes after dew, and you can mark the caesura with a double backslash. The more stressed syllables a line has, the lower the line will seem. A line will also be slowed down where there's an obvious caesura, as the reader has to pause, as they do here. Lines could have a double caesura. Again, that slows the line down even further by making the reader pause twice. And in Sonnet 73, Shakespeare even manages a triple caesura in the opening line, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang. So the line there mirrors someone thinking, revising their initial thoughts. When content-bearing words are monosyllabic, it's obvious where the stress should fall. If a word is more than 1 syllable long, however, we need to think about where, in natural English, we would place the emphasis. Take the following line. Here we've got 1 adjective, 2 nouns, and a verb. So we're going to want to stress fairest, creatures, desire, and increase. Stressing the pronoun we is also a possibility. If we follow the natural rhythms of English, we're going to end up with stresses falling, as here. From fairest creatures we desire increase. I am, Pyrrhic, I am. Alternatively, we could also decide to stress that pronoun we, making an even more regular line comprising 5 I ams. So there you can see the options. Neither of these lines is scanned wrongly. There's a choice. Note, when writing about a metrical foot, make sure that you are precise about what comprises that foot. Here, for example, you couldn't talk about the word fairest being a foot because it's not. It spans 2 feet, the first and the second in the line. One of the commonest tricks that a poet plays with metre is to reverse the first foot of a line for emphasis, and we can see this in another line from the same sonnet of Shakespeare's. Here, the content-bearing words are the verb feast, 3 nouns, lights, flame, fuel, and the compound adjective self-substantial. There's also a pronoun thy, which we'll think about a bit later. Feats, lights, flame, fuel are all, in this case, monosyllables. Feats has been elided to make it a monosyllable, so here you've got a 2-syllable word that's been compressed into one for metrical purposes. There's also 2 ways of saying fuel in English. It could be 1 syllable, as here, or it could be pronounced as 2, fuel. Here, because of the metre, it's going to be 1. And there are a number of words in English that have options like this, and you need to be aware of those flexibilities, and I'll talk about that in a little later on. Of the content-bearing words, it's only self-substantial that poses a question of where the stress should fall. It seems to me that self would seem to merit a stress. It's a word that's significant here. It's qualifying and changing the meaning of substantial. As for the second part of the word, going back to the rule of what it would sound like in natural English, I'd probably stress the middle syllable of substantial so that the line ends up looking like this. Feeds thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel. So a trochee, a sponde, and 3 iams. I said I'd return to the issue of whether or not to stress the pronoun thy. We've seen in some of the other examples that it's quite possible and quite natural to stress a pronoun. Here, considering the amount of stresses that we're getting in those first 2 feet, I'd say that it's probably best not to stress thy in this instance. We just get overloaded with stresses. We've seen in that last example how a 2-syllable word feedest can be compressed into 1 through elision. elision. That's a technique that poets, particularly ones before 1900, make frequent use of. Sometimes the poet or editor will show this with an apostrophe, as here. Sometimes that elision isn't shown, so you need to be aware of this potential flexibility. And some of the common words which are treated in this very flexible way are here on the slide. So you've got heaven or heaven, even or even, flower or flower, and words that rhyme with it like hour, shower, and so on. Or you've got toward and toward. And then you have the opposite. You have words where syllables which are usually unstressed are stressed purely for metrical purposes. And often these are the ed endings of verbs in the past tense, as in the following examples, also from Shakespeare's sonnets. With means more blessed than my barren rhyme, and that his windows glazed with thine eyes. So here, with glazed and blessed, both syllables of the word are sounded, so that the lines become 10 syllables long, as is required by the poetic form. Another quirk when it comes to metrical analysis involves rhyme, and the difference between so-called masculine and feminine rhymes. A masculine rhyme is the most usual kind of rhyme in English, and it's one in which the stress falls on the final syllable, as in the first quatrain of Shakespeare's Sonnet 9, where, as you can see, the final word of each line merits a stress: I, life, die, wife. And it's not just monosyllables that can be end-stressed either, as we can see in the final couplet of this sonnet. No love towards others in thy bosom sits, that on himself such murderous shame commits. As we've seen, a masculine rhyme is one in which the final syllable of a line is stressed. A feminine rhyme, in contrast, is one where that final syllable is unstressed. Often lines with feminine rhymes are given an extra syllable, so that a line of iambic pentameter ending in feminine rhyme is quite likely to have 11 syllables, not 10, as can be seen here with Shakespeare's Sonnet 20. And here on the slide we've got a version that I've broken down into feet. Many of the lines could be stressed in a variety of ways. From that final line, for example, you could quite feasibly stress the pronouns thy and their and end up with a line that is full of emphatic stresses. However, what is clear is that each of the lines is 11 syllables long, with the final syllable of each line left unstressed. The most successful metrical analysis doesn't simply stop at an observation about the metre, but it goes on to connect the observation about metre to the effect of the poem overall. And here, in having every single line 11 syllables long and ending in a feminine rhyme, Shakespeare is doing something quite unusual to the sonnet form. Lines with feminine rhymes aren't common. As a poet you might stick in a few for variety, but an entire poem in feminine rhyme is rare. The oddity of the metre would seem to be purposeful, therefore, and it is surely not stretching credibility too far to suggest that Shakespeare has deliberately chosen feminine rhyme for a poem about the fair youth's androgynous beauty. This boy is far from macho, and nor is the metre, and feminine rhyme is a term used in the later 16th century to describe this kind of unstressed ending. I want to look briefly at another snippet of verse, mainly because the examples until now have all been iambic pentameter. This is from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. The content-bearing words are the adverb now, the adjective hungry, the nouns lion, wolf and moon, and the verbs roars and behowls. Most of these are monosyllabic, so it's easy to work out where the stress should fall. And the lines end up being stressed as follows: now the hungry lion roars and the wolf behowls the moon. So there we've got that catalectic line again, so that despite being in falling metre, the lines end on a stressed syllable. The metre is very regular here. The extract is from Puck's incantation towards the end of the play, so that hypnotic rhyme is fitting. As such, it would be appropriate to add an extra stress at the beginning of the second line on and, a connective which wouldn't usually be stressed. So here again, you've got a choice. You can choose to stress it because of where it comes, the kind of context it appears in. So hopefully this podcast has gone some way to demystifying about how you might go about working out poetic metre. As you do so, here are some things to remember. In rhyming poetry, the shorter the line, the more regularly the rhyme will come, particularly if the poem is in couplets. This can affect the pace of the poem, making it seem faster. On the whole, it's the content-bearing words which carry a stress. That means nouns, verbs adjectives and adverbs, but we've seen other examples such as the connective and, where it's up to you to make a decision depending on context. And as we saw, it's quite sensible to decide about pronouns on a case-by-case basis, so paying attention to what else is being stressed in that line. There's often more than one way to scan a line correctly, and it's important to be precise when talking about metre, and be aware that a word can be divided between metrical feet. Where there's a feminine rhyme, there'll almost certainly be an extra syllable in the line. In contrast, in falling metre using dactyls and trochees, the line will often be catalectic, so omitting the final unstressed syllable or syllables so that the line can end on a stressed syllable. Very few poems, though, will be in an entirely uniform metre because that would sound very boring. So a poem in iambic pentameter or trotaic tetrahamater or any other metre is quite likely to have feet in it which are different from the dominant metre. And often it's in these moments of metrical difference or disruption that something interesting is happening. And when doing close reading, go beyond noting a metrical feature, discuss the effect of that feature on the poem overall.